for coming. This is going to be the kind of session I think that doesn't often occur at gatherings of academic researchers, but I know how keen we have all been to try to get some kind of sounding board of what the political world thinks about. You know, we've been working for 30 months on this. We're exhausted. And if you guys are going to tell us that we wasted our time, we will be very upset. But what we have here are four key people from four of the key political think tanks in London. Stephen Lee is the chief executive of CentreForum. Yes, not the director.
Pretty much the same thing. Actually.
Yeah, chief executive of CentreForum, who was. I want to thank at the start of this. Stephen has very kindly put a lot of personal effort into this and produced the briefing note, which you will have all seen. And he kindly invited three of his best friends along this evening in order to see how violently they will disagree with him on the subject of community, creative citizenship, and its place, potentially, in the political agenda. We all recall that when the Connected Communities programme started after the last general election, it was very much seen and criticised for that by some people as being some sort of research funding council response to the big society rhetoric or programme of the then Conservative manifesto and an aspect of the manifesto which was certainly picked up in the coalition agreement. So it wasn't something, as it were, separated the two governing parties. But we've heard quite little about the big society for a while. And what we are going to do now is to have quick interventions from each of our think tank representatives, and then we're going to have a debate around the room. But first of all, just quickly, introduction. Stephen, I've already introduced you. Down the line, just tell us who you are and your organisation.
So my name is Eddie Copleland. I am head of technology policy for a think tank called Policy Exchange. Don't know what to tell you about Policy Exchange, one of the largest think tanks out there at the moment, and unique in having a technology policy dedicated unit, which it's my pleasure to head up. So
and sometimes thought of being on the right.
So right of centre think tank.
Yeah.
No explicit links to any particular party, though. Historic links to the Conservative Party.
There we are.
I'm Emran Mian. I run a think tank called the Social Market Foundation, which was a think tank founded at the same time that the Social Democratic Party was founded, but at this point we have no party affiliation. I guess I'm also here because I spent most of my life as a civil servant, most of my professional life as a civil servant, including 2 stints working on citizenship stuff, one under Prime Minister Gordon Brown's administration, and then more recently in the Cabinet Office on the big society agenda.
Okay. Andrew.
I'm Andrew Harrup. I'm the General Secretary of the Fabian Society, which is the oldest political think tank and has always been a founder, member and affiliate of the Labour Party. Historically, we've been associated with the role of the big state, the role of collective public action at national scale. And one of the issues I'll talk about is whether that is still the case when it comes to citizenship and communities.
There we are. Now, Stephen, apart from being Chief Executive of CentreForum, is a professor of... what are you a professor of?
Damned with faint praise. Professor of Voluntary Sector Management at Cass Business School.
So he's a professor. He's also so cutting edge in cultural terms that he begins his paper on this subject with a few lines from The Sound of Music.
Well, I do. The first thing I'd like to do is to really very kindly thank my three colleagues for taking the time to come and debate this afternoon. And actually the paper did sort of emerge out of a fantastic piece of creative citizenship, because I went with my daughter, Paris, who's 16 going on 25, and for some bizarre reason she's always loved The Sound of Music, and we went to one of these sing-along A Sound of Music, which I don't know if you've ever been to one, but there are just an amazing array of different people from very, very normal backgrounds, it would appear, who come dressed in the most bizarre apparel and let rip right the way through this much-loved and aged musical. And this to me seemed like a really expressive form of creative citizenship. And when I went back and looked at it, I was astounded. Over 100 million people have engaged in this activity in the past few years. So there is an enormous sort of informal movement here of creativity and an expression of citizenship. And in a sense, in sitting down to write this sort of brief note, I'm thinking about it again as a professor of voluntary sector management. I am by inclination very positive towards notions of citizenship. I'm very pro the notion of the active citizen, of citizens being enabled. And I work within a liberal think tank which at its heart and at its core would wish to promote the notion of pluralism. And here you see an expression of pluralism. My concern, though, and the brief given to me from Ian, was to what extent and how and in what way would policymakers wish to take on this concept of creative citizenship, is that rather like the lyrics in the song, creative citizenship has the ability and the potential to be loved at an ethereal, rhetorical level, but to be absolutely meaningless, actually, in a public policy context. Why? Well, I think for a number of reasons. Firstly, you yourselves can find no consistent definition of the activity, and the activity is itself so broad to be both immensely important to the individuals engaged in it, but pretty much meaningless when you try and abstract it and think about it in a practical sense. It's also the case that in as much that it supports and promotes matters which the state would wish to itself promote, it is also there to act against the state and is in many senses anti-statist. And this is something which, as Emran and I were discussing a few months ago, whilst it might be of immense interest and engagement to citizens, it's something which civil servants tend to want to shy away from rather than actively promote. So I think for many of these reasons, the notion of creative citizenship as the next big idea, or as something that could be adopted as the next big idea, is both a dangerous one and one which I think is pretty much ill-conceived, although I'm sure others here will contend the other way. Where I think creative citizenship may well be a force and have a force for the future is firstly in its clear adoption of new technology, its clear adoption of the informal alongside the formal, its clear adoption of the importance of the non-professional alongside the professional. And I think most importantly, its absolute adoption with two critical concepts. Firstly, the notion that it is inherently relational and local. It is always of immediate impact to people in their locality, actively doing something with others and interacting with others. And secondly, and building upon that, the notion that it engages in co-creation. And I think when you think about those things, and you think not necessarily about creative citizenship, but what the impact of those things can have on different areas of discrete public policy, then I think there is an opportunity to move the thing forward from a public policy context. And I know others here will talk about public services. In my own organisation, we've talked a lot recently about mental health and about moving to an integrated sense of well-being and parity of esteem between physical and mental health, which involves at every stage the user in that process And in particular, if you wish to try and reach out and reach audiences which are not traditionally reached in the public policy process, creative citizenship offers you great opportunities. And in mental health, that's no more important than it is with the young. So I think in each of these areas, there is an opportunity, a manifesto, if you like, to take forward the notion of creative citizenship. But I'm left really thinking that if you wish to see this as a new creed, a new big idea, a new potential flag waver for politicians and for policy wonks, then you're very much mistaken. And I think the last thing I would say is, by allusion to both the third sector, the big society, and to the open society, the liberal approach to these areas, in each and every one of those cases, they were advocated for by academics or semi-academics. Not only are those policies now, each of them, largely discredited one way or the other, but the academics have completely left the scene. So for you as academics, I would be wary in what you promote.
Excellent. Eddie, big society. Who was this academic who dreamed up big society?
There was an academic who dreamt up the big
Well,
society.
that's what Stephen just said, or did he make that up?
He was part academic. I allude to him in my paper, actually.
Right.
He was actually a
Steve
principal advisor to Cameron. Cameron Conservatives. Yeah, Steve Hilton, chief strategist. Went off to be an academic in America.
Went off to be an academic.
Didn't
And
work
where?
so well here.
Which university? Which university is he at?
Stanford.
Is it a rubbish one? Stanford.
I think it's Stanford, yeah.
Eddie.
Anyway, well, if you don't mind, I'm short enough as it is, so I'm going to stand up. And I'd like to start just by saying, a few years ago, I was a politics teacher up in Cambridge. And I remember that one of the biggest challenges right at the start of the course was trying to explain to sixth formers what democracy was without giving them a massive manual from David Held or something like that. And I always resorted to the Gettysburg Address, I'm afraid, which you'll all know well, but this principle of government of the people, by the people, for the people. Whether I got the order right, if I didn't, I apologise. My take on creative citizenship is that basically we're adding a fourth option, and that's government with the people. It comes down to this kind of very loose and fluffy concept of engagement, and it's a concept that politicians do from all political colours love. Engagement they've spoken about in terms like the third way, the idea that it isn't just about government and it shouldn't just be down to the market. There's a point that we can triangulate which gives us a different option. The Liberal Democrats talk about open society. I have no idea what that is, but maybe you'll be able to tell me. Conservatives have got this concept of the big society, much maligned, and it's been relegated to, just not being used at all. You won't hear Conservatives talking about it. But I actually quite like the concept. I like the idea of thinking that government isn't the problem with everything. It's also not the solution to everything. There's an idea that government can work with businesses, that it can work with charities, that it can work with the individual to achieve a pragmatically chosen outcome that everyone cares about, that makes everyone a bit better. So politicians are really, really good at this whole vision thing. What they're not so good at is the how you do it. They do the what and the why, but not the how. And part of that, I know, because I spend a lot of time talking to civil servants, to politicians, is that at least 80% of their work is just reacting to stuff. One of the developments of technology is with the pervasive Twitter sphere, they're constantly on the back foot reacting to information, reacting to news. There's very little time for reflection, for thought at how you do things in a radically different way. That's one of the ways that think tanks try and justify their existence, why academics are so important, to have that time to reflect and to think. How do you do it? And new ideas in this sphere, I think, are really, really important. A journalist today was commenting on the Scottish referendum and said this, which I thought was quite relevant. The Westminster system, he said, is broken because it has been taken over by professional politicians who focus on their opposite numbers rather than on the people that they're supposed to represent. This has led to mass apathy and resentment did not trouble them at first. To a professional politician, those who don't vote might as well not exist. But now, the abstainers have found new champions in the insurgent parties, UKIP, SNP to some extent, People are turning up to vote for the first time in years. A grumble has grown into a war cry. The question for us then is, how do you get people engaged in a way that's within the political system, part of the democratic process, as opposed to rejecting it if they simply get fed up of the whole thing? Now, people talk about technology like this can be the solution as part of engagement, and this is an area that I spend my time looking at. Technology in lots of different spheres, from the economy to public life to the way that politicians work. And it's an attractive option. If we all know, you'll all be very conversant in the way that technology has revolutionized our lives, and engagement at its bottom is about communication, right? It's sharing ideas, thoughts, visions about how we do things. With Twitter, we can communicate with anyone, anytime, anywhere. With Wikipedia, we have a font of human knowledge that's greater, at least in quantity, than anything that ever existed before. With Google, we can find the answer to any question we want. Amazing revelations in data in collaboration. Government, however, has singly failed to take those massive benefits we've seen in every other aspect of our lives and apply them to the way that government works to involve citizens. Let me just give you three brief examples just to finish. In policy making, how do we use technology? Well, it's online polls, it's e-petitions. Those things ask for our views on preset options. We are asked to express a preference between things that have already been decided for us by Whitehall. But good policy making, at the end of the day, relies on information. That's, the fuel of government is information. Citizens out there have got incredible information, the wisdom of the crowds. At the moment, government's very good at trying to release data to citizens. There's no mechanism to bring it back up to inform policy making. That I see as a major flaw. There's a Digital Democracy Commission at the moment, started by John Bercow, the Speaker of the House of Commons, trying to look at how technology could revolutionise democracy. And we've heard about e-voting, we've heard about having a wiki group as part of the parliamentary process, a flash new website for Parliament. To me, all of these things are starting in completely the wrong place. They start by the assumption that you can bolt on new technology to old ways of working. My view, and what I keep saying, is you have to start with the process. How does Parliament work? How could it work How could it work differently? The problem with engagement is not a lack of websites, it's that people are disengaged with the political process. Get the process right, technology might be able to enable a new way of working that delivers better engagement. And finally, public services. Some of you will be aware that a lot of public services are now moving online. The government digital service creating online transactions, more convenient for citizens, but they haven't changed the substance of the interaction with the citizen. A paper form is now just a digital form. What I want to see government doing is moving away substantively from the idea that it has to do everything, that government is something that is done to citizens, and starting to take on a role where it makes things happen, where it works, as I said, perhaps that you can call it the big society, call it whatever you want, but the idea that government can work with businesses, with charities, with citizens to deliver an outcome, whereas at the moment it's just the public sector doing it to citizens. So what would I advise? Well, we will always fail if we start this notion of creative citizenship by thinking about the technology. That is precisely the wrong place. My advice, talking to politicians, I would concur absolutely with the point raised, and that I wouldn't call it creative citizenship. I had no idea what that meant. Busy civil servants and politicians will not have time unless you can take the what and the why, which they understand, and turn it into a very tangible how. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Emran.
Thank you. Well, that was quite rousing, actually, and I wanted to.
Did you think objectionably so? Objectionably rousing.
There's a part of me that wants to go along with most of that, and as I mentioned, sort of I've worked on these issues a couple of times in government, and at least during that time, I was trying to make some of this stuff happen. But I guess the role I'm going to play instead is the sort of the role that also goes well with having worked in government, which is kind of the role of the hardened cynic. And I suppose the other role is I write novels, and while I'd been a civil servant, I'd done it at the same time as being a civil servant, and it felt fine. And then when I left government, I was quite surprised by how much of a difference it made to my writing. I didn't expect it to make any difference at all. I felt that I was free when I was writing. I felt that I was writing what I wanted to write, but it made a big difference. So I guess I've also I've left government about a year ago, and I've sort of also been trying to kind of come to terms with that experience, that, what is that? And I think for me that leads to a set of thoughts about how I think the practice of the state and the practice of government probably is inimical to creative citizenship, at least in the current government that we have. I don't mean the current administration that we have, I mean the current model of government that we have. But I want to sort of think about it more positively than that. So I guess the question I want to pose is, what are the things that would have to be true about our system of government for there to be a positive interaction with creative citizens? So that's the way that I want to ask the question. So what are the things that would have to be true about our government for creative citizenship to have a useful interaction with government? Well, I think the first thing that would have to be true is that our politics would have to be about something other than just maximizing utility. I think that's really quite important. I think whenever you hear politicians talk about big society, open society, people-powered public services, there's a range of different rubrics by which we talk about some of these same things, which is sort of creating a more relational state. No politician that I've come across perceives that as being something of intrinsic value, because the purpose of politics is instrumental. And so as soon as they'll have used the words big society or people-powered public services, they'll talk about how that helps you make public services more effective, or how it helps you make public services cheaper, or how it helps to get people more engaged. All of which sort of, you could re-describe it, you could talk about it differently. It could be about intrinsic value, but it seems to me it's pretty clearly the case that, and at least in our system, that's all about instrumental value. And there I can sort of give examples from my time of government of where I think fundamentally we were just trying to create instrumental value. We were trying to sort of get stuff done, basically. And every conversation that might purport to be a conversation about partnership is fundamentally a conversation about what can you do for us. And so, for example, in my last role in the Cabinet Office, one of the things I was doing, I was heading up a team called the Business Partnerships Team. And basically the way that those conversations would go is you would sit down with a business and they would tell you about their corporate responsibility strategy, and you'd kind of listen very politely and take notes. And 15 minutes later, you'd kind of say, okay, and the PM's office wants you to do this. And that wasn't a sort of an exceptional thing about the conversation. That was a steady feature of the conversation. That's what the conversation is about. It's about creating enough of a partnership that you can ask for stuff. And it seems to me that the nature of government's partnership with most civil society organizations is fundamentally that relationship. And I think that's because the model of politics that we have is a model of politics where the job of politicians is to maximize utility. That's what we expect them to do. Maybe it's not what we expect them to do, but that's the task that they've taken upon themselves. And so I think our politics would have to be fundamentally different to that for there to be a good relationship with creative citizens. And by the way, that's certainly possible. I think it's probably only the UK and the US that have such a model of politics that's focused on nothing other than maximizing utility. I think there's two other things, though, that would also have to be true about the nature of our government for there to be a good relationship. The first is that, the second, I guess, is that it would have to be long-termist, right? It would have to have a quite different time horizon to the one that government at the moment does. And actually, the problem's even deeper than that, because even when government purports to be long-termist, it tries to be long-termist with a plan, which sounds like a good thing, but actually if you're interacting with a wider range of civil society organizations, having a plan is sort of where the trouble starts. So, for government, when it tries to be long-termist, it tries to have a plan. It tries to have let's say, a 3-year spending plan, where it tries to have a set of objectives where it wants to get to by the end of the Parliament. And it seems to me that's fundamentally at odds with an act of creative citizenship, where the possibility of dissent always has to be there, the possibility of destruction always has to be there. And you always have to be alert to the possibility that any event, any happening, any conversation, any interaction will itself reveal to you what the next thing should be. Whereas if you go into that conversation knowing already what you want the next one to be, and you have to steer that conversation and that event and that happening towards what the next one's supposed to be, then you're engaged in something different. You're engaged in public management. You're not engaged in creative citizenship. So I'm kind of taking quite a hardcore view, but I hope I explained why I'm taking that view at the beginning. It's because I've been involved a couple of times under different governments, governments of completely different political complexions, to try to create a more fruitful relationship between government and citizenship. And it seems to me there's lots of things about our system of government and the way in which politicians behave and the way that perhaps we do in the end perhaps expect them to behave that makes that relationship go badly. And then the other thing that I think shapes my perspective is the much more personal one and the very unexpected one, which it kind of has made a big difference to how I write, the fact that I'm no longer a civil servant, which kind of, you might think, duh, but it was a really big surprise to me because I thought there was no sort of inconsistency there between trying to look to the long term as a civil servant might do, and trying to be that voice of impartiality within a system of public administration. I thought there was no inconsistency between that and being a creative artist. But actually there is. They're two very different mindsets.
Very good. That's very interesting. I wasn't expecting
me to be so interesting.
The novel. I wasn't expecting us to hear from a novelist. I didn't know that you were a writer of novels. But that's a very, very interesting.
Think tank is a people too.
We have feelings. What do you write about?
So, what do I write about? Right.
All available on Amazon.
So maybe it's partly because the novel that I'm writing at the moment, that I'm trying to finish at the moment, is sort of does go to the crux of some of these issues. I'm trying to finish a novel at the moment about two brothers, one of whom is a former diplomat, and who sort of loses his job as a consequence of some other choices that he makes. So I guess it's partly a function of sort of what I'm choosing to write about, that these issues are sort of quite front and centre in my mind.
Cool. Very good. Andrew.
Great. Hard act to follow. I think the others, was thinking about what are we talking about first of all. And I tried to sort of define it by negatives. You know, what would not being a creative citizen mean? And I think the first thing I think we can all agree on is that this is an extension or part of the active citizenship agenda. The idea that citizens are much more involved in everything about them. It might be their engagement with the public sector in one form or another, but it might be how they're leading their own lives in their community, making some sort of contribution. That could go from everything from journalism through to helping, run a public service or being a good neighbour. Then there's a question about what's the creativity angle? What would an active citizen who isn't creative look like? And I guess this is something about the interplay with, arts or technology or just innovation. Sort of doing things differently, doing things for the first time. But I think that is quite a difficult, bit of this debate. Maybe you've talked about it all day. When is it beyond, when is someone not being creative if they are sort of active, sort of doing things for themselves? Then I was thinking about what should public services be doing to make this more real as a sort of phenomenon. And I think that sort of maybe a traditional liberal argument would be that it's a bit about facilitation, but it's partly about getting out of the way. Which is, and obviously not a sort of traditional left argument, but there is some truth in this. I mean, if you think about the open data sort of worldview, I mean, partly is just giving the data away, but actually there's a bit more to it than that. It's about making sure that it's available in the right sort of formats. So it's not just, it needs curating. It's not just about public services having no role, but there are potential opportunities if you like, you frame it. I'm using data as an example, but we've seen examples of great apps being developed by people. There are loads of creativity there using public data in a way that the public sector had never even thought of. Or the sort of the Eric Pickles vision of someone mining through data to hold account to a public service as a citizen's journalist. A lot less effective, as it turns out. That the sort of resources that you need to really scrutinise and hold to account actually tends to be someone someone's paying you to do that. You might be an NGO and you might be a professional journalist. Sometimes it's the bloggers who do this stuff, but the sort of I think the naive version of just citizens just mining through data for the sake of it has never, I think on examination was always questionable. So that's the sort of facilitation, get out of the way view, and I'm not completely dismissing it, but what I want to suggest is that maybe from a left perspective, what we really need to be thinking about is how to create better partnerships so that there is a role for active, creative citizens, but it is in the context of creative partnerships with public service professionals of one sort or another. We are publishing shortly a report on the future of public services, and we look at sort of what is it that there isn't enough of in the public sector, and we sort of talk about several things. And one is, I'm afraid, very necessary but perhaps a bit dull, which is value for money and driving up performance and all the stuff that in an age of austerity you can't entirely ignore. But the other two things which are important for this debate, one of them is this sort of sense of what is the public mission, the ethos, the character of public services. And the other, even more important for today's discussion, is the sense of the sort of deficits of trust and power throughout the sort of the way that we structure our public services. Maybe this is going to something that Emran's been talking about. That public services are very bad at trusting people and creating power for people. But when I say people, I don't mean just, if you like, citizens as in the users of service. I mean that throughout the way we structure government and public service. That means employees, it means the leaders of public services, it means not giving trust to elected politicians below government, below national government. So when I think about partnership, I want us to try and think about how can we have active, creative citizens working together with trusted and empowered public service workers, public service leaders, elected councillors or whatever it might be, rather than trying to sort of set the two against each other. Which I think is sometimes the tone of the debate on, sort of co-production, co-creation, whatever you use. So there are a few examples where I think there's lots of potential, which is, sort of, for example, sort of, the citizens design sort of movement where, it's a facilitated process. It's not citizens coming up with the answers themselves, but it's an engagement where you have, if you like, the insights of the users of services, where people are working with a professional. It might be facilitated by a professional designer, but it's sort of like the employees, the users of a service, and some facilitation where they are collectively creating a much better model. That is better in many cases than, if you like, to throw everything up in the air and citizens sort of doing it for themselves. And I think there is a real risk of a do-it-yourself culture, which takes away professionalism and the sort of the ethos of public services, that sort of actually has a huge amount of embedded expertise and practice, as well as sort of sense of vocation. So, for example, there is in health and more particularly social care, there's been a big movement towards, instead of just having traditionally provided public services, just giving people the money to buy whatever it is they want to meet their health needs. Now, taken to extreme, actually that has significant concerns about, sort of like the structuring of a public service. Does it still matter that we have, professional social workers creating, sort of a sense of service and community, or should we just give people cash to bring in a home help for a few hours? Now, my argument is that you need to have that sort of structure of public service rather than just, if you like, individual acts of creativity about, how can I splice together the money in a slightly different way, which is very much the sort of that sort of personalised ethos. Again, sort of thinking about sort of where does the left come on this? The big concern you get when you talk to people on the left is about inequality and people's ability and interest to be active, creative citizens. And I think, one of the, I'm sure you've had this discussion and will continue to over the course of your conference, but one of the challenges, and you'll get a wall of skepticism from people on the left if you don't engage with it, is how do you make sure this is something for everyone, rather than a sort of, if you like, sharpest elbows, people who want to, shape their community to their own interests, but not necessarily to the interests of all. How do you make sure that this agenda that really, sort of it brings common good rather than helps one group pitted against another. And actually, to some extent, it's just how do you make sure this goes to scale at all? If this is about interesting projects for a small minority that doesn't sort of, if you like, take off and become something that is actually having an impact on all our lives, then I think it's always going to be interesting but not political if it's not sort of having a big enough impact on lots of people's lives. And that, I think, sort of is a nice bridge into the sort of final set of comments I want to make, which is major concerns about the future of politics itself. And I think that this sort of creativity of citizen journalists and social media, but also grassroots campaigners, sorts of energy we've seen in the Scottish referendum, where you've got sort of not only a lot more people involved in politics than have ever been before, but also involved in very different ways, sort of thinking about their futures, but also a sort of a process of engagement at a very grassroots community level that, frankly, political parties fail to do. You also see it in the new generation of feminism we've had, very much detached from the workings of political parties, often quite suspicious, but much more creative about the sorts of issues people want to work on, not normally seen as political issues, the ways they do it, the groupings they do it. Formal politics is way behind on this, and I think formal politics will slowly die if it doesn't find a way of working in partnership with this sort of wave of creativity that we're seeing from individuals. The question is how does that go from, if you like, being an isolated, slightly elite, sort of shouty, loud on the internet, but actually not touching people's lives in a mass way. What is the role of a political party in sort of making that sort of something that touches on everyone's lives? So you have this sort of sense of how do you have political parties working in partnership in a community, but not sort of crushing and owning everything themselves. And I think that culturally is incredibly difficult for parties. They really haven't got their head around sort of being, facilitators and partners to individual effort that needs to be sort of brought back into the umbrella of a political movement, but not sort of stymied by, the culture of whips, which, pervades politics. Thank you.
Fantastic. I mean, I couldn't have wished for more interesting and subtly challenging, not some of them not so subtle, the challenge. I mean, basically, they think the idea is a write-off politically, but the thinking within the idea is striking all sorts of different chords. That would be my summary. But now, who would like to join in? Yeah.
I think the other conclusion you could come to is that politics is a write-off.
Well, that has been said once or twice, or in danger of being a write-off. Do you think that?
Well, listening to this really raises that question in my mind, because we do have plenty of evidence of a kind of growth of creative citizenry and a hunger for a democracy that comes with that kind of alertness. And then we're hearing, it's not going to work, they can't do it, there's no space for it, the systems. It was very nice to hear Emran recognising it as a kind of systemic binary that we're seeing, and that actually what in the panels I've been in today, the thing that really the things they have in common very often is a very systemic kind of approach and an understanding of the connectedness of things, and the role of creativity in understanding new connections and finding new connections and the value of the things that spring out of that. But and then I really see that this kind of the binary between the kind of the anarchism of creativity against kind of managerial utilitarianism is really problematic. But it does bring me back. It's a question I have in my mind all the time anyway.
Yeah, you don't want creative pilots, so why would you want creative politicians?
Could I respond just to that briefly? I mean, I'd just like to say I'm not as pessimistic, I have to say, and I take the point that you raised that we need long-term change, but actually I would if anyone here wants to get any of this stuff done, and I'm as excited about the potential for citizens to be involved as the next person, you have to work, frankly, in the realms of the politically possible. But I think that right now there is a massive opportunity. We need to, by politically possible, I mean local government, for example, has to save £12.4 billion by 2020. It has to. The healthcare service, likewise, by the end of the decade, will fall off a financial cliff if it continues with the current model. But there is not a zero-sum game between trying to make services more efficient and maximising utility and embracing the kind of stuff that I understand you've all been talking about today. My view is that this is financially unsustainable because the current model is broken. We need to tell politicians, you need to fundamentally rethink the way that we deliver services. We need to stop the view that it has to be government taking everything into itself and then pushing it out. We need to work with the citizens. We need to work with other people to make stuff happen in a very different way.
Okay, let's hear some more points of view. Thea? I'm sorry, Catherine, you go.
I just wanted to say, all day we've been thinking positively. We've been hearing about how cities are being used differently. We've been hearing about how, consultation is changing. It's all been fantastic. And I just came in here today and I feel so depressed and let down. And it sort of feels like creative citizens, the ideas that are bubbling up, surely if you put them working with local governments in a council, it must be some way of connecting all these ideas to addressing this kind of apathy that it seems like we're dealing with.
But why do you need them working with government? I think one of my questions is, to what extent can the innovations that you're talking about, the developments that you can talk about, to what extent do they need government?
Well,
sometimes they do, I guess, for scale. Sometimes they might need they might need government for money.
No, I don't think money is an easy excuse to sort of say this can't happen.
Yeah.
I think we should stop talking about that because we know the reality. But I think that, I guess it's just a way of accessing and a way of kind of sharing the ideas, because it's easy to have an idea, but how do you actually get it implemented? So I think maybe I see government as a route to implementing those ideas. I don't know, maybe I'm thinking the wrong way around it. But that's
Do you agree? In different ways, actually, I think everybody spoke about the possibility of a version of partnership between public service, between government at different levels, and creative citizens or citizen
yes.
groups or whatever. It's true that we heard a kind of a bit of a no on DIY, suggesting being that implies an absence of partnership. Is that a problem for you, Catherine? Seeing it as a partnership.
I think partnership is better than no government.
Yeah.
Yeah, I believe in government.
Yeah.
Yeah, I want to believe in it.
You're not an anarchist.
No, I'm not.
Okay. Sorry, I promised Theo would go first, and then over there.
It's okay, because it's kind of covered with this discussion all that we have, but it was exactly the point of most of this discussion was about building a partnership, it's about working with citizens. And in practical terms, it's exactly as we just discussed, that in some cases, I'm an academic, but we are working with organizations, charities that work with communities. And in practical terms, we do seek this collaboration, and this is the big objective that you have, is to building this collaboration. And in some other cases, is the DIY, do-it-yourself culture, where you don't actually want to, and this is actually a negative thing. And that is, for me, I'm very bad in this kind of discussions, actually, very bad, so I apologize for that. But I'm wondering if there is a room for this kind of political organization and society, where there is this multi-value kind of, when you can have various models of collaboration working. So you might have simultaneously working I don't explain myself. I told you this. I'm very bad on this discussion. I warn you. So I have the excuse. So it is. Sometimes it's about building collaboration, but sometimes it's not. So I need to have the space and the freedom to be able to act independently, but they need to have the freedom and the space to collaborate. And I don't know whether these two are conflicting or contradicting with each other, or whether this is okay, this is possible. It is possible to have the space of creating actions with communities independently, but also in collaboration in other cases, if there is this kind of freedom.
So Theo is an architect, and his collaborative work is, for example, with a community where there is a major redevelopment proposed, and creative citizens play a part in designing their alternative thinking. Stephen, you wanted to...
Well, I sort of wanted to come in on both of those 2 points in one sense, I think, and say, well, frankly, my sense, I mean, I'm sorry that you're feeling not more buoyed up. I think that there are some great opportunities if we can get the system of government to think differently. And actually, I think there is a real opportunity which is emerging very, very quickly. I mean, I'm from the liberal side of this discussion. The liberals traditionally have been the peripheral idiots out there on the side of devolution and localism and these sorts of issues. One of the things I think about creative citizenship, which I would absolutely applaud, is that it is always immediate and local to those people engaged in it. And it's often a micro response, a niche response. One of the dilemmas with government and with planning is you immediately start to think about planning to scale. So you're looking for volume. Actually, creative citizenship should, I think, promote the notion of being idiosyncratically small and growing in volume only where and if it, through happenstance, can do so, or wants to, or needs to. And whether it needs to partner with government, or with industry, or with other actors engaged in creative citizenship, it should be somewhat anarchic in that sense. And for me, I think, people have talked a lot about trust and trust in the political system and trust in society. I'm a really, really, really boring person because I've spent 12 years researching trust. And politicians actually are the worst people in thinking about trust because they conflate two very different concepts, which are actually the alternates of each other. It's a zero-sum proposition in terms of people's behavior and psychology. They put together the notions of trust and confidence. Now, governments and politicians are all about confidence, which is about having control. Trust is the opposite. Trust exists where you have no reason for confidence. It's a faith. It's an expression, an emotive expression of belief. And trust, therefore, is intensely local. It's intensely relational. It's always on the point of breach. You have to continually go back and earn it, which is why integrity is so important to trust, because it involves consistency over a long time in a normative construct, irrespective of which ideological perspective you come from. Now, what's really interesting in some of the research I did is many of our national politicians are hated nationally. They are loved and trusted beyond belief in terms of their local constituencies. Many local councillors are trusted enormously and engage in an enormous range of trustful creative behaviours. So I think my point, I'll stop because I could go on for another 10 years, but my point here is that the antidotes to your depression, I think, are in the activities of these people. I think they are there in our politicians. I think it's the national systemic problem that we face, and the way, frankly, in which the media supports that, and this notion of scale by plan by volume.
Okay, let's take the last round of interventions as quickly as you can make them, and then we'll come back to the panel for a final comment on whichever bit you want to pick up. Sophia, you've got them.
That leads very nicely into my point, because we as a small national charity have really faced the challenge of partnership with government because of the scale of our organisation, but also because of the disconnect that national policy seems to have with reality on the ground. And we've found actually the way we can influence, and I think this is something that we should think about with this creative citizens movement. I think of it as a movement. It's not about what we can do to go and convince policymakers to inject a policy. It's about a change in culture that we can help move forward that will, in a sense, influence policy through a need for change, and a change that is brought on by a movement of culture rather than just going to policymakers and saying, you need to do this because. I don't think it works that way. I think there needs to be that movement of those small changes and local changes and the stories that build that change policy in the end.
Okay, thank you. Quick points now. I think we'll just, there seem to be 4 or 5 people who would like to make a point. Yes, please.
Thank you, first of all, for the discussion. I think my point is in the same area. I'm not an anarchist either, and I came to the conclusion that government is a barrier in my life. I'm a citizen who doesn't feel the government is reflecting the engagement I want to have. So my question, and I start questioning if government is outdated, and probably is around the idea of the process is outdated. So my question is government ready for partnership?
Okay, thank you. Yes, there, and then Andy here, and then up the back there. Yeah.
Oh, thanks. So my question's about partnership as well, so that led in. So my research has been around looking at the everyday experience of food bank volunteers and clients. Now, food banks are obviously a citizen-led, volunteer-led, trust food banks in this case, a citizen-led, volunteer-led organisation. And there is something around that partnership that they have, because obviously they're very embedded within the formal systems that are already in place, and how that partnership can exist and can go forward with the work that they're doing that directly helps people within their local community as a volunteer-led organisation working with professionals. But that's a terrible imbalance in lots of ways, because if they get drawn into the system, then as a volunteer they're doing something that they're not being paid for and are taking responsibility for. So I'm interested in how you see that partnership and balance working out.
Volunteers. Okay, thanks. Let's. Sorry, where are we going now? Okay, there. Then come down to Andy and then to the back. Yeah.
I think what I heard from the panel was that there is something broken about government in relationship to a historic role of the state to protect citizens from the forces of the market. And my worry is that without the state, in whatever political form it takes, defending the history of a kind of social democracy, then creative citizenship is simply going to be co-opted as an aspect of the neoliberal market.
Okay, thank you. Come here first, and then we finish up. Thanks.
Hi. Andrew mentioned Eric Pickles' naive vision of the citizen journalist sifting through the council documents, and I used to agree with you, but I've been studying this stuff now for a couple of years, and I found some quite convincing evidence that this is happening. It's not on a huge scale, but it's there, and in many communities, and it's to be celebrated, and I think it's to be fostered too. But it's precarious for the reasons you mentioned. It's hard, it's risky in many ways to do this kind of watchdog journalism without the backup of a newspaper institution or your editor or the legal help that comes with that and stuff like that. What do you think the prospects are for public subsidy for local news startups, given the importance of local media to democracy and given the crisis of the local news industry in this country, which means that many newspapers are closing and that many communities are underserved, not served at all in many cases, but where they are, they're being served by community journalists who shouldn't be dismissed as easily as you did then, I think.
Okay, thanks for that, Andy. Last couple of points here, and then you've got Stephen, did you want to say something?
Yeah, so I just had a question back on policy. So we've been looking at the Aarhus Convention and the human rights of participation, specifically about environmental change. It strikes me in the concept of creative citizens, okay, that policy means we all have a right to participate in decision making, which is effectively consultation, which exists in our planning policy. Do you see a future where we might get to creative policy making? So a bit smarter co-design, more creativity by citizens in what we're actually proposing before we consult on changes.
Okay, that's very well put. Is that? Oh, yeah, John.
My experience of trying to establish a neighbourhood forum and do neighbourhood planning, I've been around to several of the local assemblies in my area and spoken to them about our plans as a group of people to start taking on the powers that we've been given through localism to do that. And you go very enthusiastic, and actually one of the main responses I get is in support of our local councillors, and this kind of reinforces this idea of trust. These people actually have got to the place that they're in through democratic means, and people have a lot of faith in that process at a local level, as you said, and that's my experience too. And it's led me. People always say, "How do we know you're going to be? How do we know you're going to be transparent? How do we know you're going to be democratic as a group of citizens?" And I think that's a really fair point. How do people know they can trust the few citizens that emerge as the leading forces in their communities?
Thank you. We're nearly out of time. Can we just go back up the line that way, pick up whichever of those questions you can want to deal with concisely, and we'll then ask Stephen to close. Thank you.
I think I alluded to that point as being sort of a key concern on the left about sort of the sharp-elbowed citizens. I mean, partly it is, when can this be about, sort of what we do together for everyone, rather than it sort of just being a sort of personalised take, which is hard. I mean, it's also about what's the role of public services, and one of the roles of public services should be to create capabilities for us all, partly through education, of course, but if you take a long-term view on this, it is about endowment of creativity and sort of sense of citizenship and purpose. So it's not like, this is, sort of the public sector is sort of not in the picture in terms of what it is we can all expect to do. Very hard as it is to, sort of through the education system, particularly, create a sense of creativity and citizenship. The Eric Pickles point, I mean, you might slightly misread what I was saying. I was empirically sceptical rather than sceptical about it working if it does work. But actually, your question about the funding of citizen journalists, local community-based journalists, sort of shows you the lack of resource point. If you're not getting there just through armchairs and volunteer-run websites, there is this deficit of good local journalism, and it's incredibly important if you care about localism to have strong media. This morning I was talking to a bunch of local government chief executives, and I talked to two medium-sized cities with really vibrant local media, and they were telling me how well things were going in their area, with people could name the leader of their council, which is not true everywhere. And they were sort of like, isn't that true everywhere? And I was saying, no, because there isn't a good media everywhere. And that is the route actually to the creative partnership, is you've got to have a partner, don't you? You've got to know who your sort of responsible elected leader is, even if some of what you're doing is sort of getting on and doing your own thing. You need to sort of be able to rub along the official public service offer as well. And I think previous question was sort of like, what is this all about, markets and, sort of a neoliberal view of the world? I mean, I think stepping back, with starting the definitional problem again, is, we are not very clear what the role of active citizen, civic society, sort of the space between the market and public services is. But that's partly because we're not very clear about what the role of the market is and what the role of public service is. And the politics is partly there to channel and steer markets for the public good, and we need to recognise that. But it's also there to act outside of what the markets could possibly do, and that means, and particularly about where we need to act to benefit all of us collectively, and where we need to provide us all with, the capabilities I talked about a moment ago, the things that a market transaction will never provide. So I think if we're clear about what the role of public service and politics is, maybe that's an easier sort of grounding to then talk about where active citizens should do more than, if you like, the public service is there to do.
So having been quite cynical, I guess now I have to talk about sort of something more positive. So let me offer two thoughts on sort of how I think the conversation can get better. The first one, I think sort of the question for creative citizens should be a question about, in terms of interacting with government, what are the capabilities and technologies that government has that would be useful to what we're trying to do? So kind of flip the question from one where government's asking the question to one where it's citizens themselves that are asking the question. And there's some things that government's never been particularly good at. There's some things that government's become less good at because of changes in society and technology. But there's a whole bunch of things that government is quite good at, and that it has lots of information, right? And government is able to sort of coordinate public infrastructure in a way that other organizations are not. So let's look to government to provide the capabilities and technologies that it's uniquely well suited to do. And then I guess building on that, I suppose there's a bigger point for me about what are the background conditions that government can create against which more creative citizenship can take place. And I think this is the kind of the really big stuff. So when you look at most European countries, they have a much stronger social safety net than we do, or than the US does. So if you're living in a system where when you're unemployed, your income might be as much as 80% of your income in work, I think that completely transforms what you can do as a citizen, because your act as a citizen, your struggle as a citizen changes from being a struggle about how do you pay for housing yourself and how do you pay for food to being a much more creative struggle as a citizen. Equally, a state that provided much more free childcare, a state that maybe limited the number of working hours in a week, those would be things that would just completely change the background conditions against which citizenship takes place, and you would then see much more creative citizenship. And kind of all this stuff to me about, a bit of grant here or a bit of grant there, or sort of co-opting some local organizations into a plan for doing something else is all kind of just noise. It sort of ignores the big structural stuff that government can do to sort of transform the way in which we behave as citizens.
Okay, that's good, thank you.
I guess if I can think about this concept of partnership and maybe even the creative policy making as well, I would honestly say don't wait for government. Government is inherently full of inertia. Understandably, any organisation that big is going to be very, very difficult. If you're waiting for them, you'll be waiting forever. The most impressive civic action kind of initiatives I've seen have been where people have gone, sod it, let's just build it. I think of My Society, great app set of interfaces which allow people to engage with local authorities better for sheer frustration that no local authority would do it for themselves. Now that's becoming the norm. Local authorities go to them and say, we'd love to work with you because you've built it, it's there, it's easy for us. It's not a hypothetical, it's something that they can tangibly see we can engage with. Think of some of the apps we know and love in London. City Mapper, again, born out of a guy who got particularly frustrated that TfL weren't doing it for themselves. So he built it, and it's great, and it's better than they would have done it. But he didn't wait for the public sector to offer partnership. They come to you if you have created a model that works. That's from my sort of pragmatic side, and I do urge you all to think about working. You have to work in the realms of the politically possible if you want things to get done. There is, like it or not, a financial reality which means that government does not have money, and it won't do for the foreseeable future, whoever wins the next election, to be able to support new initiatives. You need to find ways where they're sustainable for themselves. My view, and maybe I'm playing the stereotype of the centre-right think tank, I wouldn't support local subsidies for local news precisely because I worry that you build something great and then the next government takes away the funding, and what are you left with? I'd far rather we grasp that entrepreneurial attitude where people go, let us find a way that we can actually make this work, and whatever business model, whatever social enterprise model makes it work, build something that's community driven and about the citizen.
Stephen, last word.
Well, my last word is I'm rather concerned because I agree with everything that pretty much everybody has said as we've gone down the line. And I think that's really where I started from, really, with this notion of creative citizenship, that it's so intimately connected with motherhood and apple pie, that at the one hand it's much beloved, potentially, rhetorically, by politicians, but actually the articulation of it in public policy terms is really very, very difficult. And you have to get down, I think, into subsectors of actual functional policy activity. And then I think when you start to talk about either areas of activity such as journalism or architecture or neighbourhood planning, or where you start to talk about the impact it can have in driving access, in supporting and improving democracy, social mobility, where it can help to transform. And I agree absolutely with what Andrew was saying about public services and a public service ethos, but where this can actually enable people to gain greater access into those services, into their design as well as into their delivery, I think that you can have a real public policy impact. And for me, that's the place of this sort of embryonic manifesto, if you like, for creative citizenship. And I think ultimately, it isn't a one thing. Ralph Dorendorf very famously talked about the voluntary sector as being completely anarchic and it being important to let 1,000 flowers bloom, and for many of them to die, and to die in very different ways. And actually, it's probably not a movement. It's probably not a thing. It's probably not even a process. It certainly, I don't think, can work in the main as a scalable activity. But when done well, it definitely drives trust and a sense of purpose. And it brings a strong normative element back into people's lives, which I think is very important.
Thank you very much. It's time for a drink. Please thank the panel.